I'm Tulsi Desai, and I'm a UX researcher and engineer, and this is UX Pursuit.
Welcome to UX Pursuit, a podcast dedicated to the unique stories and journeys of UX practitioners, how they got where they are today, what hurdles they overcame, and what advice they have for those currently pursuing a thriving career in UX. I'm Tim Bridgham, your host, and my hope is that these conversations might help and inspire those who are currently on their own UX pursuit. I'm happy to have Tulsi on the podcast today. Her journey follows a somewhat common, but also uncommon path into UX. In our conversation, Tulsi shares about her path from research intern into full-time researcher, all this after trying to rekindle her passion for UX several years into working as a mechanical engineer. I think you'll enjoy the interesting perspective she brings on how to successfully transition into a UX career. Well, Tulsi, thanks so much for taking time to chat today. I guess let's start where all good stories start, at the beginning. So tell me, how did your kind of UX career or your UX journey begin?
Yeah, it began a while ago, actually. So my freshman year of undergrad, I majored in mechanical engineering. When we start there.
Okay.
My freshman year of undergrad, I already knew I wanted to be a mechanical engineer. But one of the first courses I took was something called Engineering Innovations. And it was taught by a professor who was a mechanical engineer, but also had done some work with IDEO, which is a design firm. And he showed us, he taught us about human-centered design, and he gave us a book, The Art of Innovation by Tom Kelly. And that was one of the first times I'd ever heard of what human-centered design was. And I was like completely enamored with it. I was like, this is the kind of like engineer I want to be. Like, this sounds amazing. This is like exactly what I want to do. And we did silly things. I mean, now looking back, it seems so silly, but we did things like we would create like bug lists or like keep track of all the things that bothered us and then find ways to kind of design solutions for it. It was a really small kind of version of what now I know to be UX and human-centered design. But it was such a small taste of it, and I was so excited about it. And I'm not sure what happened. In those 4 years, I feel like I completely got sidetracked into engineering and kind of realized, well, first of all, my undergrad didn't have an actual kind of major under product design or human-centered design. So I was like, you know what, I'll just stick to my undergrad degree with mechanical engineering. And year after year, I guess I kind of slowly forgot about that excitement, that buzz. And I just got so sucked up into engineering that I ended up graduating and just kind of continuing my career as an engineer. And I ended up working for 5 years as a manufacturing engineer. By that point, 9 years later, I had totally forgotten about that one class. And I basically worked out in Houston, Texas. So I worked for an oil field service company as a manufacturing engineer. And a lot of my roles and responsibilities were just around being on the shop floor, ensuring the quality and production of our tools. And I realized in those 5 years, I started kind of backtracking on this goal of being a mechanical engineer. I was like, I've done this for 9 years, or not 9 years. Yeah, I guess 9 years at that point. And I was like, I don't know what is the thing that gives me that excitement anymore. It's not this. And I started kind of going back through memory lane of like, what have been the things that have been most exciting to me in my life. And I recalled that class 9 years ago at that point. And I was like, I really loved this thing of design. And so I started doing a little bit more research into it. And I was like, well, how in the world am I going to move from manufacturing into design?
Before you kind of talk about that move to, UX or user-centered design, what were the things that like really sparked your interest or really, made you excited or like passionate, that like that first class, and then that you kind of came back to after 5 years of being an engineer?
Well, I think at the core of it, it was that we were solving for why we wanted to build the product we wanted to build. And I felt like mechanical engineering wasn't giving that to me. Like, it was really interesting to figure out how to create a product and like make something real and work with your hands. I love that aspect of it. But figuring out the why was, I think, the core of what I felt like wasn't there. And I felt like with the approach of human-centered design and with the approach of UX and research, that why is like pretty much the core of the career and like what you get to spend the majority of your time on.
So is it fair to say you were just kind of told, hey, create this thing, and you never got a chance to really understand why you were creating it?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly it. Even throughout my work, the product lifespan for the things that we were building in the energy sector is it's 10 years long. Like, some guy who's probably no longer at the company or maybe now at like a different function or a different, world, decided that this thing needed to be built. And you kind of lose that why as you kind of go further down the chain.
Okay.
Especially manufacturing, you're already kind of building the product. So I felt like I was missing that.
Okay. Interesting. Cool. Yeah. So then you started the process of figuring out, okay, how do I get from an engineer with 5 years experience to something in UX?
Yeah. Basically I was like, well, how do I make this transition happen? And I will never forget some advice that one of my managers had given me at the time. He had no idea I was looking for another kind of role, but he had told me, make this job what you want it to be. And those words have always kind of stuck with me. And basically in that moment for me, what that meant was like, well, what do I actually really love about this role? What do I want to keep doing? What do I want to do less of? What do I want to not do at all anymore? And I realized the parts of what I loved so much about my job was all the interactions I had with the people on the shop floor. So I spent the majority of my time basically on the assembly line, working with technicians, figuring out what was challenging for them and figuring out how to translate that into design changes on our product. And I love those moments of kind of collaboration and working together and not just taking what they said word for word, but taking that and then translating that into something that was really useful for the design that could be technically feasible. So step one was basically figuring out like what are the things I want to keep doing? Like where do I want my UX career, design career to go? And then step two was like, all right, well, I have all these kind of skills and I know I want to do design. Like, I know that this is right for me because it matches to the things that I love so much about my current role. And I was like, well, I feel like it'd be really hard to just make the jump by just applying somewhere, because I don't know if anyone's going to understand why a manufacturing engineer wants to do design.
Yeah.
So I decided to apply for grad school at that point.
Okay.
So I basically applied for a bunch of different grad school positions. A little piece of me was still really hesitant about going into design, so I actually applied for a lot of mechanical engineering grad school positions as well.
Interesting.
Because I was like, I don't know, what does a career look like with my background in the design world? That wasn't very clear to me.
Are there, with the engineering side of grad school, were there sort of programs that had focus around research or user-centered design or anything like that, or were they just completely you were just going to say, I'm just going to dive into engineering 100%?
So the schools did have some focus or some program or some research being done around design.
Okay.
So it felt like I could still have kind of a tie into that world, but still keep kind of my technical skill set. And it's kind of like a safety net in a sense.
Okay.
And so I applied to those, and I actually, I applied to Stanford, or I knew I wanted to apply to Stanford because I knew that they have a really well-known design program. And I actually took a trip out there just to kind of see what everything was all about. And I walked into the mechanical engineering building, and I was like, hey, like, can I had done like no planning on the trip. So I showed up to the engineering building. I was like, hey, can I like go on a tour? And they're like, oh, we don't do that. You can't, just walk into a faculty member's office. I was like, okay, is there anything I can see while I'm here? Because I flew from Texas. And they were like, well, there's this info session going on for the design program. And it's actually starting in 5 minutes.
Wow.
You can join that. And I kid you not, I had not planned that like absolutely at all. So I was like, okay, well, I mean, like, what do I have to lose? Like, this is something I was interested in. Like, I mean, maybe I'll just join the info session. So I joined it, and it was like that same spark hit me that had hit me 9 years prior to that, of like, this is really where I feel like I can make the most impact. So ended up applying.
Cool. Okay. And so was it like, I know Stanford sort of connected to IDEO. Was it sort of that connection that made you discover Stanford as the school to go to?
Yeah. So that's, basically going back to what I learned from that professor, the connection to IDEO, knowing that there was a focus on it, not just at the undergrad level, but also at the master's level. So they seemed to really, they had done product design for so many years. To me, it seemed like there was a lot of expertise at the school. And then also just seeing kind of the students that came out of it, the wide range of how they applied design was really intriguing to me. It wasn't just a cookie cutter, you go to school and then you design screens. It was like you could design anything or apply design in so many different industries or facets. So that definitely appealed to me.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. So did you discover other mechanical engineers in grad school, or was it, a wide breadth of different backgrounds?
Yeah. It was a wide breadth for sure. So my class was 13 students in my year and then 13 students in the year above me. So it was pretty tight knit, but just even within those 26 students, we represented like a bunch of different majors. We all had some type of technical background. So there was somebody who had a background in chemical engineering, someone else who was software, someone else who was electrical or mechanical. One of my close friends was, her background is psychology, biomedical, you name it. So it was like people kind of like spanned a wide range. And then you had like a handful of people who had been practicing design and who wanted to continue building that skill set. So it was a really interesting place to be because we were all finding our role in design together. Like it wasn't just like we're all here to pursue UX research, or we're all here to pursue visual design or UX design or whatever kind of subset of the degree. It was like who are we as designers, and how can we take this approach and apply our lens to it?
Your lens, as in like your background for you in mechanical engineering?
Yeah, exactly. Like how do I, like, who am I as an engineer and as a researcher? Like that sounds like really existential, but like I felt like it really kind of came to that. I'm saying all this now with like, hindsight's 2020. Sure. I feel like I went to the program and I was like, I'm going to be a designer. And I just thought that was like a career, but within design, there's so many different things, and you have to figure out kind of where you fit into that big puzzle to see like where you can leverage your skills. So for me, looking back, those 2 years were about, definitely learning skills, but also like where do I fit into the design world? And really, I think when I look back to my career search after grad school, and also in the summer in between, figuring out who I was as a designer really was tied to that process of like recruiting and talking to people and figuring out like what career path or what job would be the best suited for me. So that process of talking to people and discussing kind of, this is my story, this is what I'm interested in, that really kind of really cemented, I felt like, who I was as a designer.
Cool. Yeah. I think that's super valuable and something that I think a lot of folks getting into UX can really maybe resonate with, or at least hope to resonate with, the fact that, we all come from different backgrounds, and to not say that, oh, well, my mechanical engineering background won't impact that. It's kind of a wash where like, the stuff that I studied when I studied architecture, like that's, a waste now. And it's like, well, no, it's not. Like it still informs how I look at things and what I'm passionate about, and that informs my job. And so I think that that's really, really wise and profound of you to think about, how does your background really influence who you are as a UX practitioner? And, you've mentioned design a lot, and, you're a researcher. So I'm curious, and was it through that process you said of sort of looking for jobs and figuring out what's next, like that you kind of steered towards research? Is that kind of, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. It was definitely through the process of applying for jobs. Like I started off being like, I'm going to apply to design roles. And then I realized like I was way too ambiguous for anyone to know what they could do with me. And so I basically like step one was like, pick something and then just see what happens. Like test something out, talk to someone, tell them your story, see what resonates. And that whole process of just like saying who I was and explaining my story in the context of design and saying like, all right, I'm a researcher, like that's what I want to do. And just like that kind of feedback loop of talking to people was like this meta design research process for me. I feel like, I mean, again, hindsight's 2020. I didn't know that. I was like, I just need a job. But like talking to people and kind of, just sharing my world and learning what stuck for others and why they chose research, why they chose design really helped me realize like research seems more intriguing to me. And research seems like the space where I feel like I can leverage some of the things that I used to do as a manufacturing engineer.
Right. Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. So then, so you graduated, and then it was time to look for a job, were you looking for internships or full-time jobs after that? Or what was your kind of process?
Yeah, I was hoping to go straight into full-time. That would have been fantastic. But I also knew I was graduating right in the midst of a pandemic. And so for me, I really wanted to just for me, what was most important out of my next role was finding a community where I could have mentorship and where I could really build on the craft of research, but also not stray too far away from the design world. Since I practiced design throughout grad school as well. And so I didn't want to just kind of be pigeonholed into one thing. And so kind of with that lens, I basically started kind of shortlisting some companies that I thought were interesting or doing interesting work. Looked at anybody that I knew, anyone that my friends of friends knew, basically looked at my entire network to see if I could try to reach out and just talk to people and learn, like, is this really what I think this company is like, just from the website? And is this role really what I think it would actually be like? So for me, I relied much more heavily on like people's stories and their experiences rather than just kind of what I was reading online. Because I felt like, I don't know, all job descriptions for a researcher could look really similar, but I imagined it probably wasn't. So, so that process of talking to people was super important. And the way I got connected to Blink was, actually a long series of connections.
Yeah, I was curious how it got to that point.
Yeah, I had contacted, on one hand, there was somebody who had graduated from the product design program from Stanford. Well, first I had heard of Blink through one of my friends. Mm-hmm. She was like, "Oh, you should check them out. They do cool work." So I looked up the company, and I was like, "Oh, like this work seems super interesting. They also do some stuff on hardware too, which is really cool, even from a researcher's perspective." And so basically I was like, "Okay, this seems interesting. Let me like find people who work there." So I went through a contact from the product design program who connected me to somebody in the San Diego office. And then I had reached out to somebody at at Instagram like a while back. And she connected me to somebody she knew at Blink who was a designer. He connected me to like one research director who connected me to another research director. And that's basically how I ended up kind of where I ended up. It was a long series of conversations, but I think each one of them was really helpful in affirming to me, like, this is the group of people that I think I would love working with. This is the company I'd love working with.
Yeah. I imagine that's a way that, is who we know that is so helpful in all these times. I mean, my story is similar, that you kind of fall into who you know and what happens. And I'm curious, do you have tips or advice for people as they're trying to develop these connections, or like what to do or what not to do when you're doing this?
Yeah. So I think over time, so I was like tracking all of my coffee chats, so to speak, because I was just really curious at the end of the day, like how many people I'd end up talking to. And I think it was like 70 plus phone calls. So it was a lot of time. But what I realized was the people that ended up being the most helpful to me, and the people who ended up being my biggest kind of proponent, ended up being ones who had made a transition in their career themselves. So once I started kind of realizing that pattern, I started trying to just target people who had basically come from a different field, who had worked for several years and then transitioned into either research or design. And for me, that was like valuable in two aspects. One was whatever they did, I could learn from, like, how did they make that transition? And the other side of it was like, they understood the struggle of the transition. So they could very much be like, they understood where I was coming from. They weren't as by the book when it came to like, oh, you don't have any, experience as a UX researcher. Like, why would you be looking for UX research positions? Like, they totally got that my transition made sense. Yeah. So that, like, finding people who are similar to you, I would say was a huge benefit for me.
Cool.
And I guess in terms of things not to do, don't just reach out to people expecting they're going to respond. You really have to do your homework in terms of like why you're even reaching out to that person to begin with. Time is super valuable for everyone. So for me, the people who I heard back from most often were ones that I would have done a ton of homework and pointed to a specific article that they wrote, or some work that they're doing currently that I am super interested in, and that really helped me out.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, do your homework. I talked to someone else in the podcast, and they were like, "Don't just show up and be like, okay, cool. Tell me about UX research, or tell me about Blink." Ask pointed questions, or come with a point of view, I suppose.
Actually, I think like one kind of meta comment about that whole process was, one person actually pointed this out. So she was a UX researcher at a research firm. And she said, "I could tell by the way you're asking me questions that you have the skills to be a researcher." And that was like in the context of the coffee chat. And it just like dawned to me, like, holy cow, the way that I am talking to people in these like coffee chats, like it's not just about the content, it's like it's all of the other contextual clues around like how I'm asking them about their story, that all translates to how I might do research and what might clue them into, me being a potential good candidate.
Yeah. Yeah, that actually brings me up to another question I had was just around I know you're starting out, but obviously you have a lot of background, and your time in school and your internship is super valuable. But as you're thinking about it, what are the skills? You mentioned sort of this idea of how you ask questions. What are the skills or qualities that you think a good UX researcher or a designer, as from your perspective, should possess or work on as they're trying to get into UX?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and a lot of these are kind of soft skills, and then we can maybe talk a little bit more about hard skills.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the biggest thing is like, it sounds really cheesy, but just like truly listening and not being judgmental. It's really easy to think about your own experiences and wanting to like add to a conversation and flavor it and make the person feel comfortable by expressing how similar you guys might be,
Mm-hmm.
or your opinion. But I think in not only like moderating, but also kind of an analysis, being able to listen to the data, listen to the people, and not hold judgment, I think is a really important skill to have. I think the other part of it is also understanding kind of your role as a researcher and where that fits into where your work is going. So understanding kind of like who are your stakeholders. Like it might be a client if you're at a firm, but it might also be like an internal stakeholder, like the design team is going to take your research and move it forward. And understanding their needs in addition to the actual needs of the user that you're interviewing or whoever you're interviewing, I think is a really important understated part of the process. I think it's like one thing to be a great moderator and like come up with these awesome findings, but if you can't get anyone to do anything with your work because you don't understand where the work is going, then your impact stops right there. So just understanding the needs of your stakeholders, I would say, is super important.
Yeah, I think that gets to that listening point as well, for sure.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, no, definitely.
So I think we kind of got off track at least a little bit on the steps in your journey, but then you landed an internship at Blink this past summer. And I'd love to just hear about your experience being an intern or like having that work, or, did it sort of, how did it match up or maybe not match up to what you were expecting coming out of school and thinking about a career?
Yeah. So in terms of what I was expecting or hoping for, I really wanted the ability to have some ownership over a project, and I really wanted to get some client-facing exposure. I feel like I do best when you can kind of throw me the reins and I can do something with it. But if something is like over constrained, then I'll probably get too concerned about the constraints than actually doing good work. So I was looking for some kind of ownership. I would have loved to be aligned with a project that meant something to me, that felt like it would be really impactful. That was like an ideal goal.
Yeah.
And I was looking for mentorship. I really wanted to expand on the skills I learned in grad school and fill in the gaps of maybe what I didn't learn in school and what you can't learn in an academic environment. So on all of those accounts, Blink did really well.
Oh, good.
So the project I worked on was a pro bono project for Blink, and it was an intern-led project where myself and another intern were basically I was on the research side, the other intern was on the design side, and we were leading a full user-centered design project for a company called Sistabiz. So Sistabiz is a business accelerator for Black women entrepreneurs. And they basically help them with whatever support they need to get their businesses off the ground and to get their businesses scalable and profitable. And the challenge that they were facing was that the membership base was basically scaling, but in terms of what the team at Sistabiz was able to provide, it was really limited because it was just like a bunch of emails that they would send to kind of support their members or a post on Facebook. And they were really feeling like they were going to lose engagement really soon if they didn't find a way to scale their own business, basically. And so they came to Blink saying, hey, we need kind of a way to be able to meet the needs of our paid members. And a way to kind of make our support scalable for them. And so it was a super interesting space to work in because I think from a personal standpoint, just hearing the stories of all of these business owners who are kind of coming up with something from scratch, from the ground up, with pretty minimal support. It's usually like one or like a solopreneur or, maybe a couple people in their business. And they're oftentimes doing this alongside a full-time job and kids and all sorts of things going on in life. So just hearing kind of why they started their business, their challenges along the way, and also their love for Sistabiz. It was like really, really, just heartfelt and genuine. And it felt like whatever we could do, myself and the other intern, whatever we could do could not only help this one company, Sistabiz, but could help all of the members and their companies as well.
Yeah, cool.
And so it felt like it was just like this multiplier effect on whatever we were able to do, hopefully could get out there. So that I was really grateful for having the ability to make that kind of impact. I guess another really interesting and challenging aspect of it was just the idea of race and of empathizing with a culture that is not my own as a researcher. So I think like a few things kind of helped me in that regard. Like I feel like just the ability as a researcher to provide like a really safe, non-judgmental space for people to feel open and be able to share kind of what they're going through is important. And I think another important aspect of that was just inviting your members of your user group or your client, in our case, our client, to be a part of the design journey, to be a part of the analysis, to be a part of the iteration. So we could just self-check, like, are we totally off base with what we're hearing here? Or like, is this what you're hearing too? So I think there are a lot of ways researchers can make sure that, even if they feel like they totally are not like the user group that they're working with, whether it's race, whether it's something totally different, like, like industry or whatever, there are a lot of ways to make sure that you're in check with your target group and, you're not just kind of coming up with something from your biases.
Sure. Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I haven't had really studies around that realm of like where race is so important or is a key element of it. But, thinking about talking to these professionals who are so like in the weeds of this, like, engineering thing that I have like no experience with, that like you have to sort of, listen and, come at it with a little bit of knowledge that you do have or experience that you do have, and then try to like make sure, like you said, you're checking and you're validating what you're learning or what you're interpreting with like, again, like with the client or with other kind of similar user types. I know I've had conversations with like Blink engineers to be like, hey, are we understanding what these engineers are telling us, or we're kind of getting maybe like an internal stakeholder interview around like the subject matter is a good way to kind of go around that.
What's like kind of interesting about that space, or just like the idea of like interviewing someone who's more expert at something than you, or something that, maybe you don't have any experience in. I really felt like that was a moment where I was actually leveraging some of my skills from manufacturing, which sounds really funny because it's like, what does that have to do with that topic?
Yeah.
But like, obviously in my example, I'm not speaking to engineers, but so really early on in my career, like I'm talking 6 months into me joining as an engineer, there was like a huge downturn, a bunch of layoffs, and I became a manager of like a team of 5, and I was 21 and like very different from the people I was managing. And the team I was managing was a team of experts. They like knew their tools. They knew how to build them. They had been working in this industry for like 20 plus years. They were more than double my age. And so like learning how to ask the right questions and learning how to create that open space to where like you can add value, but you don't have to be an expert to add value. I think was a really important skill that I was able to take from my previous experience into research.
Nice. Yeah, that's super great. So what's next, or what are you kind of thinking about for next steps for your career? I know you just started a full-time gig, so, what are you thinking about next?
Yeah. Oh my gosh, it's been like go since I started, so I haven't had a ton of time to think about that. But I guess the way I envisioned my career in the short term is that I want to get a lot of experience in research to build my craft. I feel like I have a lot of experience in like kind of process engineering from my previous career. And I feel like the two of those lend themselves really well to the field of service design. So I'm really interested in basically in finding a way where I can not just do design research in the future, but also combine that with my previous experience into service design. So what I mean by that is like mapping out like an entire space or entire territory and understanding the breadth and the complexities and nuances of a particular ecosystem, and then being able to still dive deep and do research in a particular area to see how a part of that process can be improved. So I feel like there's a lot of synergy there. So I see at some point in the future service design to be a part of what I do. But that's as far as I've gotten.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of was in the same boat as you. You're just really wanting to soak up as much different methodologies or different approaches as possible to sort of like just hone my skill, and then some of those bubble to the top as sort of more interesting and more obviously some of them are more challenging than others, at least as I've found. So that's cool. You've kind of at least identified something to go towards. Who knows? You may something may come up and then you go down a different path, kind of like the start of your career, and then all of a sudden you're on another thing. So who knows?
Yeah. Yeah. I hope that to be the case. I think I over-index on the planning of my career as a mechanical engineer, and I felt like if I was more open to those moments of like following my interest, then I could have seen another career path or another kind of side of the world that could have also lent itself to design in the long term. But who knows? I feel like kind of following your heart and following the things that are most exciting to you lend themselves to the careers that you end up being most passionate about. So, yeah.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Cool. Well, do you have any other sort of things around your UX journey or words of wisdom that you feel like folks who are on their own pursuit of UX should be considering or thinking about?
I think one big thing I've learned about my career and my journey is to not like hide or apologize for a career that I used to have before research. One thing I left out when I was talking about basically how I got to where I am today was that for the entirety of like my first year of my grad program, my portfolio just did not include anything that I had done before in engineering. And it sounds ridiculous saying, like, I feel ridiculous saying that now, but my thought process in that moment was, well, that wasn't design. Why would anyone want to look at this? What value would that have? And now I feel like after going through the job search and after talking to so many professionals in the career, I feel like that's the most important asset that I have. That's my depth and that's my lens into research. And so I want to, I guess my words of wisdom for people, especially if you're transitioning, is like, don't say you're pivoting, you're building on your previous career. That's something that's like very much a part of you, and that's very much a part of the lens through which you do your work today.
Well, yeah, Tulsi, thanks so much for taking time today to share your story. If people wanted to, connect or reach out or maybe learn a little bit more about you, is there a way that they can do that?
Yeah, absolutely. They can find me either on LinkedIn or through my portfolio. You can, there's a way to contact me in my portfolio. It's tulsidesai.com.
Well, yeah, thank you again. I really appreciate your time and again, your willingness to share your story. And I think it'll be really good for lots of folks. So
yeah, thank you.
A big thanks to Tulsi for joining me on the podcast. I love how she talks about leaning on the skills she learned in her engineering background, leveraging them, and using them as a lens into the research she does. Since so many in UX come from different backgrounds, this is an important thing to remember, especially if you're building on your previous career and transitioning into UX. Thank you so much for checking out the show. If you're thinking about are pursuing a career in UX or currently work in UX, I hope you find these discussions informative and helpful. You can find UX Pursuit wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe now, and if you know others pursuing a career in UX, please tell them about the show. To learn more about me or the show, check out uxpursuit.com. The website is a great place to learn more about all the guests from season 1 of the podcast. For all you listeners out there, I need your help. At the end of the first season, I'm planning a panel discussion to answer your UX career questions, and I know you have questions. So please email me at hello@uxpursuit.com, and we'll do our best to cover them in the final episode of the season. As always, a big thanks to Irene Barber for creating all the music you hear in the podcast. Be sure to check out her music under the artist name Nearby on Spotify or at nearbymusic.bandcamp.com. Again, thanks so much for listening. I'm Tim Bridgham, a senior UX researcher, and this is UX Pursuit.
After the internship, no, it was like a phone call, basically being like, "Hey, yeah, I'm glad there wasn't another round of." I was like, "You already know me at this point, hopefully."
Yeah, my internship was enough of a job application.
It was like a 10-week interview, so
Nice.
Yeah.